Hopefully between the last session and this session, you had the chance to read through the book of Hebrews and to make some big lists based on some of the topics and themes that you picked up going throughout the letter. Hopefully you also had a chance to write out some questions that you had. It's my hope that over the course of the next 7 or 8 videos, we would have the opportunity to answer some of those questions that you identified through your reading. My guess is that having read through the book of Hebrews, one of the things that really jumped out to you was just how many different ways he describes Jesus. How many different pictures he gives us of who Jesus is, what Jesus has done, and why it makes sense for us to persevere in our faith in him. There are 2 different ways of getting into a swimming pool. My kids, they know only one way of getting into a pool. The only way that they know how to get in a pool is to run as fast as they can to the side of the pool and cannonball right into the deep end. That's the only proper way for them to get into a pool. Dad, on the other hand, I'm not quite as enthusiastic. The way I get in the pool is 1 toe at a time, then a foot, then a leg, and eventually I'll just kind of ease in. That's not how Hebrews begins his book, though. Hebrews begins his book not by tiptoeing in, but with a full-on cannonball. One of the ways that Hebrews is different than so many of the other letters of the New Testament is, we don't have a greeting. We don't have, like so many of Paul's letters begin with a prayer where Paul will address his audience and tell them specifically what he's praying for. There's no introductory material in the letter of Hebrews. It's just a cannonball straight into the deep end. And so that's how we're going to begin. We're going to begin where Hebrews begins, in chapter 1, verse 1. Here's what the author of Hebrews says. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. I want you, once again, to pause the video if you're watching this at home. Pause the video and with pen and paper, just make a list. What are some of the different ways that you hear Jesus described? Especially in culture. What are some of the different ways that people talk about Jesus? Write those things down. Write down a list of all the different ways that Jesus is talked about, and then we'll return back to Hebrews chapter 1. Now I'm guessing that as you made that list of all the different ways that Jesus is described, the things on that list, they're not necessarily wrong. They're not necessarily inappropriate or unbiblical. But I think what the author of Hebrews would tell us is, or the question that the author of Hebrews would ask us is your Jesus big enough? Are the ways that we describe Jesus, are those big enough to adequately describe who Jesus actually was? Hebrews, in chapter 1, he's actually echoing what Paul himself says back in the book of Colossians. In the first chapter of Colossians, here's what Paul says. Some of this language will sound familiar. He says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers, rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything, listen to this, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Hebrews echoes some of those very same ideas in these first verses of his book. He's comparing here Jesus to the prophets. And the prophets were primarily representatives of God. The prophets were God's mouthpiece. They revealed who God was and what God's will was for his people. But in this passage, he's saying in the past, God spoke to his people through the prophets. But he did this through various ways and at various times. But now he's spoken to us not through the prophets, he's spoken to us by means of his Son. Not merely a prophet, but the very Son. And the way that he describes the Son in this passage is according to the three different ways that the Messiah was described in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God's anointed one, God's Messiah, fit three different roles. The Messiah was a prophet, the Messiah was a priest, and the Messiah was a king. All three of those offices in the Old Testament were anointed to be God's Savior, anointed to be God's representative. And so in these 3 or 4 verses at the beginning of the book of Hebrews, Jesus is described using prophet language, priestly language, it says after making purification for sins, and also kingly language. He sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. What Hebrews is saying, not so subtly here at the very beginning of his book, is that Jesus meets all of our needs and all of our expectations to the uttermost. And there's 3 points in particular that I want you to know from these first few verses in the book of Hebrews. The first thing that Hebrews wants us to know is that Jesus has a unique authority. Jesus has a unique authority. He emphasizes the fact that Jesus here is sitting at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. He emphasizes in verse 2 that Jesus has been appointed heir of all things. There's authority language all throughout these first 3 verses. The second thing that he wants us to know is about Jesus' identity. Jesus has a unique identity. He says in the middle section of this verse, of this passage rather, he says, "The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being." The radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. The word for representation there in Greek is the word character, which is where we literally get the English word character from. And it was used in the coin-making process in the ancient world. What they would do is they would take a disc of metal, a soft disc of metal, and then they would have a stamp. And they would stamp that disc of metal, and whatever image was on the stamp would be left perfectly into the metal disc, creating the coin. And that stamp was called the character. And so what Hebrews says is, Jesus bears God's stamp. If you want to know who God is, look to Jesus. He's the radiance of God's glory. This sounds a little bit like John chapter 1, when John says, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, where John uses similar language there, where he talks about the word becomes flesh and makes his dwelling among us. What Hebrews wants us to know is not only does Jesus have unique authority compared to the prophets, he also has a unique identity. He's not merely a prophet. He is the exact representation of who God is. He is the radiance of God's glory. This is no small Jesus. The third thing that he wants us to know is he also wants us to know about Jesus' power. It says in this passage that Jesus has both created and sustains the universe itself. Think about that. He says of Jesus that Jesus has created everything that is, and nothing would exist without his sustaining power. This is a huge Jesus. In the next section of Hebrews chapter 1, as he continues on, he moves from comparing Jesus to the prophets to comparing Jesus to the angels, which makes a lot of sense because the prophets were representatives of God, but so were the angels. An angel's job was to represent God to God's people. And so he says that Jesus is not only superior to the prophets, he's also superior to the angels as well. And what he does in Hebrews chapter 1, the rest of the chapter, is he uses various quotations from the Old Testament in order to make these same 3 points about Jesus as far as his authority is concerned. He quotes Psalm 45 in verse 9. He says, verse 8, he says, "But about the Son, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever, and righteousness will be the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has set you above your companions by anointing you with the oil of joy." What's fascinating is if you look at that same psalm back in the Old Testament, it was very clear who that psalm was referring to. That psalm was referring to God. That psalm was referring to Yahweh. And now the author of Hebrews takes that psalm and applies it to Jesus and says Jesus has this unique authority. He sits upon a throne forever and ever and ever. He talks about Jesus' unique identity as well. And later on, he quotes from Psalm 104. And he says, in verse 6 rather, he says, and again, when God brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. In speaking of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds, his servants flames of fire. Now again, if you look up that psalm back in the Old Testament, Psalm 104 is where that comes from. It's very clear that the angels there are worshiping God. They're worshiping Yahweh God. But the author of Hebrews takes that psalm and he says, that's really about Jesus. Jesus has this unique identity higher, certainly higher, than even the angels. And he talks about Jesus' power. In verse 10, he says, in the beginning, O Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will wear out like a garment, you will roll them up like a robe. Like a garment they will be changed, but you remain the same, and your years will never end. That's from Psalm 102. He associates Jesus with laying the foundations of the earth, having this unique power. But not just a unique power, also a unique authority and a unique identity. Later on in the book, actually in chapter 13, very last chapter of the book, he'll remind his audience that this Jesus that you've given your life to is unchanging. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so even though the world looks like it's fallen apart, even though it looks like the world is crumbling, even though maybe it looks like your own life at times is crumbling, you need to know that Jesus never will fail you. Jesus will never abandon you. Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And what I want you to think about is I want you to think about the purpose of starting the book on this note. To people who are struggling in their faith, what they need is they need a big picture of Jesus. They need to be reminded that this Jesus who we worship is sufficient. I don't need anyone or anything else as long as I have Jesus. He's greater than the prophets. He's greater than the angels. He's greater than any other authority. He has a superior identity, a superior power, a superior authority. I can place my life, I can place my trust in him. Now, as we close, just like I did in the previous video, I want you to think through, reflect on, and perhaps even discuss a few questions related especially to the message of Hebrews chapter 1. This text challenges us to be careful about making Jesus too small. It challenges us to be careful about allowing anyone or anything else to become larger than Jesus. So my question for you is this: did you hear anything in Hebrews chapter 1 that was new or challenging to you? Imagine hearing this message for the very first time. How would this message encourage you and bolster you in your faith? Have we allowed Jesus to become too small? And how does a big Jesus help us to persevere over a lifetime of faith?